Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. We're so glad you're here for the third installment of Israel and the Middle East with Professor Dr. Paul Liptz. We're so delighted that you're here. We're going to just wait another minute or so to see if more people join, because that's always disruptive to our process to have people join in the middle. If you wanted to or didn't get to see the first 2 weeks of this amazing series, they are on the Kol Ami YouTube channel in full, so you can see the other two presentations by Dr. Liptz. And today, our presentation is really on challenges and opportunities, and he'll be building a little bit on last week's presentation on the a piece of peace. What are the opportunities and challenges ahead of Israel and her neighbors for actually finding a sense of shalom, a sense of peace together. So I'm still admitting people are still coming into the Zoom room, so I think I'll wait another 30 seconds or so and to try and get us make sure we have everybody here. We will be. Professor, will you have time for questions this week?
Yes. I'll end 10 minutes early, and then
great. So we'll have some time for Q&A. If you please feel free to put your question in the chat as it comes up. If a question comes up for you. During his presentation, or if you still had a question from last week's presentation that you've been kind of holding on to all week, please be sure to put that in the chat as well. If you'll stay muted so that Paul can make his presentation, and then we'll be able to have some question and dialogue at the end. So without further ado, we're so glad to welcome you back to Congregation Kol Ami, Paul. Thank you for this really been amazing and thoughtful presentations that you made. So we're looking forward to today.
Thank you so much. It's good to be with you, all of you, once again. This is the session that today will be a different one from the other ones, because the Middle East has some new and positive components. I've been dealing with Middle Eastern issues for over 50 years now. And there were many periods which were so depressing that I kind of would wish I was in a different field. But to be honest, since the Abraham Accords came into operation, there's some very interesting and important parts, but at the same time, tremendous challenges. I really do feel that the topic challenges and opportunities is very much what we'll be talking about. So to try and move into the big picture. I've got on my screen, this meeting is being recorded. So hold on, this will help. That's great. So what's the big picture? What are we kind of really talking about at the moment? So the first thing we have to realize about the Middle East, and I think everyone would agree with me, that it's a part of the world which attracts a tremendous amount of attention from the big players. The United States, France, United Kingdom, Russia, and China are all very much involved, which on some occasions is good news, and other occasions makes it extremely complex. The other phenomenon that I think is very important is that it's an Arab part of the world essentially, but we've got 3 non-Arab countries, which, by the way, look at events differently in many ways. Here we have Turkey, Iran, and little Israel somewhere over here. Then the other phenomenon which I think is important in the Middle East is the division between the Sunnis and the Shi'is. It's a long story, but the basic tension started in 680 CE. And in some ways or other, that's very much part of the environment until now. The fourth component is the unbelievable differences between the rich and the poor. The rich, by the way, are pretty much involved in Israel, and the poor, unfortunately, are just trying to keep their heads above water. And then finally, at the moment, we've got 3 civil wars going on: Morocco, Yemen, and Ethiopia, with very tough environments in Syria and Libya as well. So some of the realities. I want to make a comment which came very clear to me many years ago, and that was when we're talking about Israel, we really have to realize that there are two components of how we see ourselves and what we really are in the Middle East. One is the official picture, what the agreements we've signed. Officially, we're at peace with Egypt, officially peace with Jordan, and unfortunately, the agreement with the Palestinians fell through. We had an agreement with Lebanon and it fell through. And that's one world. But there's a totally different other world as well, which I had to realize at a very certain time, that it's almost as if we're living on two different planets. The official level is of high level tension, and the unofficial level is quite amazing. It's remarkable. In the days that I was going back and forwards to Europe for one reason or the other, the number of occasions I found myself sitting with someone from one of the enemy countries. Well, speaking to someone from a friendly country like Egypt or Jordan was obvious. But to sit, for example, a wonderful evening with a woman from Lebanon, and initially we kind of both felt a little bit uncomfortable. We were both very interested in certain realms. And within 10 minutes, I'd totally forgotten that she belonged to a country which was defined as an enemy country. And the same thing happened on a fascinating visit to Budapest, where I came into contact with a young man from Tehran. And, Iran's our great enemy. Once again, it's something which I just cannot forget, how quickly we forget who we are in our national sense, and how easy it is to become just individual people. So in very difficult situations, and for years and years, I've been trying to explain to people when things seem very desperate, that there is always another side which hasn't yet become the official side. So that's my comment about informal contacts tell us totally different story from official ones. The issue of Israel, which the elephant in the room, and there are a number of them, is the question of the Temple Mount. It's the site which I mentioned earlier, excuse me, in our very first session, the nature of Jerusalem and how Jerusalem is looked at by Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, it makes it a very, very awkward situation. It could be very wonderful, but religion and politics, when they come together, they sit in the same room, makes it much more difficult. The great moment I think that we've had in the Middle East was actually with the Oslo Accords. And immediately after the Oslo Accords, a significant number of countries were trying to establish relationships with us. That kind of fell through, unfortunately, quite soon afterwards as a result of Rabin's assassination. Now, the other elephant in the room, besides the Temple Mount concept, is clearly the Palestinian issue, which I'll bring up in more detail a little later and try and explain perhaps how Israeli society understands the Palestinians, because I know from my very tremendous amount of visits to the States or to other parts of the world, it's always an issue, and I think it's sometimes quite difficult to understand how the Israelis are interpreting it, because I think people in other parts of the world look at the situation differently. And just to end on this slide with good news quickly, actually, the figures of trade in January to August 2021, the figures grew by 234%. So in a very, very short period of time, what we're actually seeing is that trade is growing. And we know that business agreements always lead to better understandings of each other. Now, the Abraham Accord, the agreement is much bigger than I think was originally intended. And what one has to recognize is the very important role of Donald Trump. He came forward And from an Israeli perspective, and I'm not talking about internal politics either in America or in Israel, from an Israeli perspective, the ongoing support of the United States enables us to make agreements in much more easily than if we didn't have that support. That means we're seen as a colleague or a client, a friendly client of our patron. And many of the countries who then want to move forward with us really see us in the shadow, in a certain sense, in a positive shadow of the United States. And that certainly helps a great deal for us to move forward. So the Abraham Accords really had a goal, and that was self-reliance. This would be agreement between countries where essentially both sides felt that they were gaining things. If we look at the UAE, which for us at the moment is a very important player, the initial reason why the UAE moved from being a country where we had low level of relationships, 2015, so that's 6 years ago, we've already sort of been in ongoing contact with the UAE. Their initial issue was very much the F-35 aircraft and intelligence sharing. So we obviously don't have the F-35, it's an American airplane, but immediately what we found is that the UAE, trying to get closer to the United States, felt that friendship to Israel is a vehicle for achieving that. The UAE very, very quickly has interacted. Social media personalities are with us, politicians, academics, tourists, and visit Israel. And as we'll see on the next slide, what Israel is getting out of it also. We now have an embassy in Abu Dhabi and a consulate in Dubai. And the trade between our two countries, just to give a specific figure, is you see from rising from 51 million, this is the UAE figure, not the whole area, 51 million in 2020 and 616 million in 2021 up to now. The UAE speaks about a $1 trillion economic relationship over the next decade. By the way, they're pushing very forcibly. They're all totally on board, which when we signed the agreement with Egypt, it worked much, not nearly as quickly. Who are the UAE and why would they possibly be so interested in us? Well, the UAE is a population of 10 million, but only 12% are the local Arab citizens. So here we have a country which is a very small number of local citizens and a very large number of outsiders who've lived there sometimes a number of generations, but aren't citizens. So we're talking about a country which is internally insecure, economically secure, but internally insecure. And that makes it important for them to have a comfortable relationship with as many allies as they can get. So in some ways, they're similar to Israel. Both of us realize the importance of allies. They have, in history, through history, been very frightened of the Iranian threat, although in 2019, they established trade relations, but the UAE are Sunni, Iran is Shi'i, and that really, Israel is part of the Sunni world, and that therefore makes this particular kind of relationship that much easier. Israelis have been flocking there, and if it hadn't been for Corona, I'm sure the number would have almost been doubled. They very quickly try to show that they're sensitive to who we are. I'm not always sure if Israelis are all that sensitive to who the other side is, but the UAE certainly went a long way to show how interested they are, and they recognize Holocaust Day as an event in UAE society. I don't know exactly how they're going to do it, but they've already said, we recognize the importance of Holocaust Day, Yom HaShoah, for the Israeli people. A nice comment came from an Emirates student who's at one of our universities. I chose to come to study in Israel and I have a strong desire to contribute to the advancement of peace. We have an embassy, a UAE embassy in Tel Aviv, And just a day or two ago, the commander of the UAE Air Force visited us. By the way, these kind of events are, my apologies, these kind of events are not just symbolic, they're very important. They indicate a great deal when a military person from another country, remember, we've only been allies for a short period of time, actually come to visit us. An article which appeared this morning actually speaks about the UAE taking on an important role in increasing the Israeli contact with both India and Japan. There's a kind of an interesting agreement which we already have dealing with these two countries, but there's no doubt about it that if we carry on with this relationship, it won't just be an Israel-UAE concept, but it goes a great deal further. The different country that's essentially in a different situation is Bahrain, small island, somewhat similar to the UAE. Once again, we see a situation, very small population, where the majority of the population are not citizens. But here the problem is much more complex. In Bahrain, 70% of the population are Shiites, and they are dominated, the controlling force, the monarchy, and the core group of leaders are all Sunnis. And in 2011, there was an attempt to overthrow the regime. The Saudis came in very quickly and helped Bahrain. So in Bahrain, they're looking to Israel, I don't think necessarily to bail them out in a military situation, but to once again help them have a sense of stability. And certainly the Israeli intelligence successes would be very important for a country like Bahrain. The people from Bahrain popped in very quickly. In November 2020, they were already on the Temple Mount. Very interesting event on the Temple Mount, by the way, was that the Bahrain people were on Temple Mount with their Israeli colleagues, and the Palestinians were very angry about it. And we'll come back to this issue again, which I think the Bahrain people were rather surprised. They said, you know, we're coming to the Temple Mount, surely you Palestinian Muslims would understand that us Bahraini Muslims, this is a common area. We should be happy to meet on Temple Mount, but it didn't work out quite as easy as that. There were also tensions. We can't make this whole story just seem wonderful, but it was very clear that in December last year, the Bahrain Minister of Industry, Commerce and Tourism visited Israel and was very, very positive. Their foreign minister was very critical of Israel. Once again, the foreign minister has to deal with the intricacies of the Middle East and the wider world, and the Minister of Industry, Trade and Commerce is actually dealing with something which is much easier and less political. So we find that in countries, and it's true within Israel, obviously, that different groups are understanding these realities in a somewhat different way. In January 2021, the foreign minister, who had seemed quite antagonistic the month before, mourned the victims of the Holocaust in a letter to the Israeli foreign minister. Important components. Short time after, their ambassador came to Israel. Just a little after that, Yair Lapid, our foreign minister, opened our ambassador in the capital of Bahrain. And just a very short time ago, in an unusual event, which really kind of did strike me as being unusual, Bahraini visitors joined prayer services at the Western Wall. Now, you know, as Reform Jews, we know that the Western Wall hasn't been such a welcoming place. Here we have a situation which is very unusual, where a Muslim group is actually being welcomed and joins prayer. I'm not quite exactly sure how the prayer service worked, but that in itself indicates some phenomenon which we really haven't seen until now in Israel. Now, Egypt and Israel had a cold peace for the 12 years that Benjamin Netanyahu was prime minister. There was it wasn't comfortable. And here recently, and once again, these things can change, but we're trying to understand the contemporary reality. Last month, President El-Sisi and Prime Minister Bennett met in Sinai. Here, pictures become very important. Earlier meetings between Netanyahu and El-Sisi didn't have the Israeli flag there. Here, we see in this official picture, it's very significant. Flags, by the way, are, as we know, are very important symbols. Here, the fact that the Israeli flag is very, very clearly part of the picture, and here's the Egyptian flag. These two gentlemen apparently got on very well. And then we ask the question, why is Egypt so very keen at being friends with Israel? After all, we are a small country and in the mind of some people, a fairly problematic place. So firstly, the issue of the United States. America is angry with the human rights behavior of Egypt, legitimately, by the way. And the Israeli government apparently asked the Americans to lower the level of their official anger. It's true that 130 million was reduced from the aid budget, but this was important. Israel is seen by the Egyptians as being an intermediary. One of the main problems facing Egypt at the moment is the Ethiopian dam conflict. The Ethiopians are building a massive dam, and it's going to deeply affect the flow of water down the Nile. Egypt as a country is totally dependent on the Nile. Without the Nile, Egypt is nothing. It just can't survive. And therefore, Egypt, like Israel, needs allies, and they feel that with us on their side, rather than on the Ethiopian side, that would be valuable to them. Both of us deal with Sinai, and the Sinai is a somewhat restless area, and the military agreement between the Egyptian military and the Israeli military in Sinai is important. Egypt, being a poor country, definitely wants tourists, and it's much easier for tourists to go from Israel, just in the southern border of Taba, than tourists coming from overseas, particularly with Corona. So this is money coming into Egypt. And the last place, which is obviously to Israel's benefit, is that Egypt acts as an intermediary with Hamas. And now, just a short time ago, we have direct flights between Egypt and Israel. Morocco is another story. Each country, by the way, is another issue. So we in Israel really have to become very sophisticated in not looking at the Arab world or the Middle East as one sort of homogeneous society, but to try and understand the different complexities of each country. So what happened with Morocco? Firstly, Morocco had the largest Jewish community of any of the countries in the Middle East. And by the 1960s, a considerable number of them had left. Morocco has been very committed to informing Moroccan Jews wherever they live, in Israel, France, Canada, United States, and other parts of the world, that Moroccan Jews are welcome not only to come home and live there, but certainly to visit. And this is an important component. And if we would ask, why is that the case? Well, there would obviously be some components of financial gain with a significant number of Israeli, mainly Moroccans who visit, not only, and other Jews visiting Morocco. It's an appealing country for Jewish tourists. But there is something which is much more important in terms of the realpolitik of the Moroccan government. And that is, Morocco has an issue with Western Sudan. Here we have Western Sudan. Western Sudan at the moment, all this yellow part over here is under Moroccan control. And the red part is under a foreign, in the language of the Moroccans, terrorist group called the Polisario. Polisario are supported by this large country, Algeria, There are very, very tense relationships between Algeria and Morocco. Therefore, once again, the Moroccans feel that just on this very clear political level, because this is their number one problem at the moment, besides certain internal issues, then Israel, with its connections to the United States, with its military understandings and sophistication, could really be to the advantage of Morocco. Like many of the other countries, they have mentioned again and again their belief in the two-state solution. Relations improved very quickly. There were visits on both sides, and the direct air connections are starting in the next few days. By the way, which will bring about a tremendous movement of Israelis visiting Morocco. Morocco has gone a long way to ensure that the religious sites, the sites of a Jewish pilgrimage to the various saint areas of the religious leaders of past would be well looked after, and that Jews coming to Morocco will feel safe. King Mohammed VI has made very, very clear statements in terms of those ideas. Jordan, another case study, so very, very different. With Jordan, we have, historically speaking, had relatively good relations. I know that might sound strange because both in 1948, we were in military conflict with the Jordanians, and once again in 1967. But that had some other event involved by virtue of the fact that Jordan sees itself obviously as an integral part of the wider Arab world. The problem with Jordan, their internal issues are tremendous. Starting off particularly in 1971, the Black September Organization, the Palestinian Black September Organization, just to remind us that it seems to be that the majority population in Jordan are Palestinians who've been there an earlier period of history and then afterwards in 1948 and 1967. The Black September event had a very damaging impact on the relationship of the Hashemites, who originally come from Saudi Arabia, and the local Palestinian population. Now, I think the Jordanian government feels that we in Israel understand the Palestinian issue. We ourselves have our problems with them. And I think this has really been pretty much at the back of the mind of earlier Jordanian leaders. Here we have King Hussein, who was an amazing king, just a remarkable human being. He was always very aware of the fact that he has a minority government, somewhat like Bahrain in many senses. And here we have the Bedouin soldiers, who are the core group of the Hashemite kingdom. There are Palestinian citizens in the army, but they tend to be in less important positions. So we're beginning to understand that here is a kingdom, here is a country, which is grappling between various tensions. So that's one issue. That certainly led to the 1994 peace agreement. Largely, by the way, due to the tremendous success of President Bill Clinton, who managed in his unusual ways of bringing people together. And this was an easy agreement. It was much easier than the agreement with Egypt. There were 30 clauses or something, but the clauses, the sub issues worked very, very quickly. What are the challenges facing Jordan? Jordan firstly has a very large Syrian refugee population, massive, very tremendously large, has a poor economy. It depends to a large extent on financial assistance from Arab countries. It is very much aware of the threats to the monarchy, not only, by the way, from certain Palestinian factions, but also from local people, particularly in the southern areas of Jordan, the tribes, which used to be great supporters of the monarchy, are much more critical today. And then certainly the water shortage. As soon as the Abraham Accords got off the ground, Jordan jumped into this whole ambience of getting on better with us. And there were very successful meetings initially between the king, Abdullah II, we see him with Prime Minister Bennett, and a little later on, the king with Yair Lapid, who's our foreign minister. And then there was also a meeting with the President Herzog. So very quickly, the two sides, I think, have tried to move ahead from the tensions which existed under the earlier control of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Trade is growing. Trade is a deeply important issue in all parts of the world, particularly in countries with fairly delicate economies. So here we see, we've been mentioning trade on a number of occasions. Here we see in January to August 2020, the trade between us was 136 million in those 8 months. And in the last 8 months of this year, up to 224. Now, you know, when we talk about peace treaties, the reality is that the piece of paper that's signed, while being very important, is not the main issue. And the main issue is essentially what happens on a broader level. By the way, this we recognize very much with Egypt. The agreement with Egypt initially seemed very much to be a piece of paper, and it's been quite difficult for Israel and Egypt to really get to the more people-to-people level. But this has actually happened comfortably with Jordan, particularly recently. The important issue was this month, Israel agreed to double the amount of fresh water that we sell. We are selling water to Jordan at 65 cents per cubic meter. We Israelis pay $2.50. Water is very expensive in Israel. Anyone who comes here know that to see a sprinkler just, you know, pouring out water, some of you know this yourselves from various parts of America, is seen as something quite horrific. So this has been a very clear venture. Once again, very important, Jordan has said in the various negotiations that there is no alternative to the two-state solution and comprehensive peace. By the way, just very recently, Jordan has opened the negotiations with Syria and vice versa after over 10 years of absolutely no contacts at all. So my hope, and you can see that I'm kind of quite excited about what's happening, my hope is that even with our enemies like Syria, if countries tend to feel more comfortable and there's a better understanding, maybe we really can reduce tension. I don't know if we can always sign peace treaties, but it seems to me that secure societies are much more able to move ahead together. So that's why, whereas some of my Israeli colleagues have a philosophy that I totally disagree with, that as long as the Arabs are fighting each other, they'll leave us alone. I think that's a very short-term kind of way of looking at the world. On the long term, comfortable societies, stable societies move ahead together. So that's very much my own understanding. Saudi Arabia has been a somewhat more difficult issue. Why did the Saudis, after a continued period of being very distant from us, why did they start becoming friendly? By the way, the friendship started about 10 years ago, at a time that I know that colleagues of mine were talking about it, and it was totally unofficial. It was really under the table. Very much the kind of playing around with us, political playing around that's going on between Israel and Saudi Arabia is tied up with the character and the behavior of MBS, the Crown Prince, who's a very rough person. We know in terms of the killing of the Turkish journalist, very rough person. But in April this year, the Saudi foreign minister gave a very clear statement how the Saudis are looking forward to some new developments with Israel. By the way, because the Saudis and their control of Mecca and Medina, the process of normalization is not going to be easy. But I think even the better signs seem to be of importance. And he mentioned, the Saudi foreign minister mentioned, normalization with Israel would bring tremendous benefit to the region. By the way, I thought his language was interesting. But such an accord with the kingdom would depend on progress in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Once again, however we look at events, the Arab governments introduced the issue of the Palestinian population. I don't want to sound cynical, my apologies, but there is sometimes a feeling that when the Arab governments speak about the Palestinians, it's very far from doing anything really to help them. So I put this into the kind of salad bowl of language of when is language used seriously and when is language filled with action. And all of us know that those two components of life are often in tension with each other. The Saudis quickly showed that they were prepared to cooperate with us. They opened their airspace, which is of major importance, a gain of 3 or 4 hours in travel time. This year, an important change was that they altered their language of relating to the dhimmis, the Jews, the Christians, and certainly the non-believers, they call them the infidels. That was important. It means that Saudis would learn different things about Jewish and Christians. The Saudi military is having a tough time against the Iran-linked Houthis. The Houthis are a group they're Iran-linked, but they're in Yemen. Very much there's a deep tension going on between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And it's very clear that the Saudis are not only going to look to Israel to try and get support, but in April this year, we saw that the Prince MBS was seeking to improve relations with Iran as well. By the way, at the back of the minds of many Israelis is the idea that America might be leaving the Middle East, might be moving much more to the Chinese arena. And I think that being at the back of the mind of people maybe indicates that the partners in this area are going to have to work out how to do things, and we can't depend on the American involvement or even foreign involvement in the same way as existed in the past. Turkey, very quickly, ups and downs. We never know where Turkey is. It sometimes says very positive, makes very positive in context, sometimes negative. And just to maybe once again, even more on a symbolic level, July this year, a 40-minute conversation between Presidents Erdogan and our president, speaking about bilateral relations, economic ties, trade and tourism. By the way, trade and tourism with Turkey carries on. Turkish Airways is always at our airport. So we know that even if on the political level, we have a great deal of contact with tension with Turkey, on other levels, things seem to be better. Now, was a surprise. The Middle East is filled with surprises. After one or two unusual situations where certain Iraqis in 2016 visited us, there was very little public information on it. Then in 2017, a totally different kind of relationship where Iraq's Miss Universe and the Miss Israel in the competition were seen together in a picture. And they both said how well they're getting on. Well, her family was forced to flee. So we find that it's a very tense issue to be an Iraqi and to show too much friendship to Israel. But the family went somewhere in the world, and the young lady, young woman, came to visit us and meet her Israeli friend. The most important event, once again with strange ups and downs that we know in the Middle East, was the conference last month in Erbil. Erbil is the Kurdistan capital. We've had excellent relations with the Kurds over the years, and actually many years ago even supported their military. In Erbil, there was a conference of 312 Sunni and Shiite Iraqi leaders, by the way, significant, both Sunni and Shiite, and they called for full normalization with Israel. Here we see their picture. It's very, very clear who they are. And the people in the know are telling us that these gentlemen over here are important tribal leaders. The Iraqi federal government immediately rejected this idea of normalization with Israel. And the top Shiite in Iraq, Sadr, who's actually done very well in the last elections, demanded the arrest of all of the participants, and many of them have apologized. Is this the end of the relationship? Probably not. These kind of things have a way of moving forward. Once again, maybe not on the official level, but certainly on the unofficial level. Now we come to the Palestinians. And I'll ask you just for a moment to look at this. This survey, with a very respectable survey center for research, carried out by the Palestinians. They've done very good research over the years. I want to tell you where the issue of the elephant in the room has catches itself in terms of Israeli society. Israelis are reading these figures, maybe not this particular set of figures, but certainly other figures. And just to see what, from the Israeli perspective, regardless of our political points of view, I'm clearly on the left of center, but regardless of where one is politically, Israelis are reading these figures. And this is one of the issues why I think even many Arab governments, who, as I said earlier, speak about assistance to the Palestinians, but apparently don't do a great deal to help them. The exception, by the way, is Qatar, which gives a few times a year $15 million to the people in the Gaza Strip, to the Hamas. But although $15 sounds a lot of money, it's small change in terms of the Qatar economy. So where are the Arab countries? But let us look just for a moment from the Israeli perspective. 62% of Israelis oppose the concept of a two-state solution. Very important issue. The Arab governments are basically saying they believe in a two-state solution. But according to this survey, and with all the problems of surveys that we understand, it seems to be that 2/3 of the Palestinians are against it. 61% of the Palestinians oppose unconditional resumption of Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. By the way, to start any negotiation between warring parties with well-defined the no's in before the negotiation starts isn't going to happen. So if one's going to get together, you have to get together and say, while we're sitting together, we'll decide what we're going to talk about. So in advance, if 2/3, almost 2/3 say, you know, we're not going for it anyway, however you do it, that worries the Israelis. 56% of the Palestinians oppose a return to dialogue with the new US administration under President Joe Biden. Now, the Americans are just about the only players in the Middle East at the moment who can bring these various groups together. They've had a tremendous impact in the past, and I've always seen American political involvement as being beneficial to the area. But if over half of them say, you know, we're not even interested, we're not going to be involved with the Americans, that makes any attempt to really change the contemporary environment much more difficult. And to take this last one in red, 54% of the Palestinians support a return to armed confrontations and intifada. Now, this is a survey. Surveys don't always indicate all the realities of a situation. I've spent many, many hours in the last 50 odd years speaking to Palestinians. They have a whole range of different perspectives, just like any other society, and certainly like Israeli society. They have tremendous differences one from the other. But at least on the kind of more official level, and there is a question here, by the way, talking about official level, to what extent does the average Palestinian citizen feel that she or he can really say what they want or what they feel in their hearts? And because we're speaking about a Palestinian government in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria, and or in other parts, and certainly in Gaza as well, can they really say what they want? So I do think we have to look at the seriousness of this survey, and at the same time, try and imagine what could happen on the unofficial level. There are many of us, and unfortunately, I do believe that this comment by Abu Dhabi in 1973 is significant, that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And this came up briefly last week, and I think it's important to mention now. Almost at the end, what's the big picture? The big picture is that we have a moment in history with the Oslo Accords, which was very, very good for Israel, and this should encourage us to try and move forward as much as we can, because the gains are tremendous. Israel assists, and I think this is extremely important. I think it is a selling commodity of our society, the help that we give to countries in need right across the world. If there's an earthquake or a drought or anything else, little Israel is somewhere out there. At the same time, once again, putting political views on the side, the role of Donald Trump and Jared Kushner was extremely important in starting the process. And now the political leaders have to carry on with it. And as I mentioned earlier, American involvement is extremely important. To conclude, well, we know where we might need to go. Certainly, the United States is committed to Israel's safety and security, and at the same time favors moves towards the two-state solution, which in Israel, by the way, is a very complex issue. The surveys probably show that Israeli society is totally divided on the two-state solution, split down the middle in one way or the other. And for those who favor the two-state solution, there is always a sense of concern that what would happen if the Palestinian state is created, and where we live in Israel, the Palestinian state would be about 10 or 15 minute drive away, if that state became an enemy state. So once again, regardless of one's political views, there is a fear on the Israeli side, as there has always been a fear on the Palestinian side, about the long-term expectations of the other. We see that several Arab countries expect a solution. The new Israeli government is creating an atmosphere in the region, a new atmosphere in the region. Will it last? We don't know exactly what's going to happen to this government. Very important issue, which I don't think we've even started to really deal with. And that is, what is the role of the Israeli Arab Palestinian citizens, Israeli citizens of Palestinian origin? They could be extremely important in being intermediaries between Israel and the Arab world. And I think it's a realm that has to develop. And certainly always to try and deal with these issues with a kind of a sense of optimism and hope. The Tanakh tells us very clearly that there are different ways of behaving, and, you know, beating swords into plowshares, it's a good idea, and spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And I certainly, and I'm so sure there are many, many people around the world would hope that that is really going to be the reality of the Middle East in the future. I'll stop sharing now and we can move to questions. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you for that really powerful overview, Paul. That was really really up to date. I've had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Shakaki so many times, and I met with him last when I was in Israel last in November of 2019. And those numbers in this most recent survey have dramatically shifted
Right.
in that 60% that are really against any kind of two-state solution. When in November of 2019, when I met with him and spoke with him with a group that I was leading, those numbers were still under 50%.
That's right.
So
Absolutely.
there's clearly been a huge shift. Can you address a little bit of what that shift is about among the Palestinians to now almost 2/3 of the, extrapolating that almost 2/3 of the Palestinian
sure.
population are against a two-state solution?
I think there are a number of reasons. Firstly, there's within Palestinian society a tremendous loss of faith in their own government, the feeling of corruption and things like that. I think they're in a situation of total desperation. They're desperate about their own government and desperate about Israel. And I think their whole mindset at the moment is a kind of a no situation. We're not going to try anything. Nothing's going to happen. I must tell you that my own contact with Palestinians over the years, at various levels of Palestinian society, they would often be so desperate, even, on the good days with the Oslo Accords and things like that. I think the desperate part exists, and I think it's increased. By the way, I think that Israel has also played a very negative role, which has brought about what you've correctly mentioned, that where the figures have changed, where we have this other, additional 10 or 15% of people who now are totally lacking in any kind of hope. So, I think it's a whole set of issues. I think also the fact that most Arab governments have a hands-off feeling about the Palestinians has made them less secure. And, I mentioned, I think a number of times in my presentation, that insecurity leads to lack of trying to improve reality. Yeah. And I think that the Palestinian people are really a tragic people. I really do. They belong to a massive religious group in the world. The Jews are 0.2% of the world. They're this massive 30-something%. And I think their sense of loneliness has in many ways led to some of the figures that we've seen.
One quick, and we'll open it up if anybody has a question and you want to either ask it or chat if you want to raise your hand. Sudan, which was part of this Abraham Accord, there was a coup just yesterday,
That's right.
So I mean, it was a kind of a cold accord. Could you say another word or two about Sudan?
Good. So it's fascinating. Thank you for mentioning that. This morning when I looked through this PowerPoint, and there are always new things, and I can never assume that what I gave yesterday would be relevant for today.
Yes.
So there were new bits of information that came in. I took out the slide on Sudan, because as soon as you have a military coup, all the political agreements fall away. So it would have really been a situation. Now, what happened with Sudan, by the way, was Sudan was after with the Khartoum agreement, the famous no's, no to peace, no to negotiation, no to anything with Israel. It really became an enemy kind of country. Sudan was very isolated in the world. And once again, the main issue of Sudan was that they were looking to the American government to assist them. They're in a terribly divided situation. It's a three-country country at the moment. I think that they looked to Israel. They said that if they move slightly closer to Israel, then they're going to get American help. I think that was the basic reason. But Sudan is such an insecure situation. The second coup in a few months, and terribly violent. I mean, everything that goes on within the region of Sudan proper, Darfur and southern Sudan seems to just be, it's one of those parts of the world that the other parts like that. Somalia, for example, is very similar.
Yes.
These countries which are just totally torn apart from inside. And I believe that when a country is in that situation, it just doesn't have the energy to then start negotiating with outside groups like Israel, because the internal dilemmas are so serious and tragic. And I think that's exactly where we are with Sudan. I must admit the long-term projections of what's going to happen there are very, very gloomy.
Wow. Thank you for weighing in on something that's just really in the headlines right as we're in class. Anybody want to open up their mind, have a question that they'd like to ask of Professor Liptz? Want to be respectful of that? Shane, sorry.
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Yeah, so thank you. This has been so fascinating. Every time I wrote down a question, you answered it in the next slide. So, but I was just wondering how, if you could speak to how relations are, or if there even are any relations with Lebanon. Because I don't.
Good. You know, Lebanon, I've studied 25 countries in depth. Lebanon is one of the countries that I visited. I was in the Israeli army in 1982, and I was in the center of the Shiites of Lebanon, which is kind of not necessarily the place I'd go for a holiday. But I got to know the Lebanese quite well, by the way, on that visit and some of my contact with the Lebanese overseas. There are vast factions in Lebanon who would totally want to be good friends of Israel. There's no doubt about it. Very, very significant groups. Significant number of the Sunnis would favor it. Certainly the Christian groups. There's 7 well-defined Christian groups. There's some smaller groups as well. They would absolutely want to move forward. There was actually an agreement with Lebanon at a certain time. It's collapsing. The problem of Lebanon is really the Hezbollah. The Hezbollah is totally aligned to Iran, a very defined enemy of the state of Israel, and extremely powerful. Nasrallah, the leader, has managed to bring the Shiite factions together, both Hezbollah and another faction, the Amal, to really under his control. And I think that's really stopped any kind of possibility of moving ahead. But on a people-to-people level, I have no doubt that at least 50 or 60% of the Lebanese would love to be in a totally different situation with us, and we would love it. Lebanon is a beautiful country. I mean, just in terms of being a tourist, if I couldn't go to Morocco, which I'm planning to go to sometime, my other choice would definitely be Lebanon. It's a comfortable country. The Lebanese are wonderful people. I mean, I was there as a soldier, but you know, when they forgot that I was a soldier, we were just friends. And I haven't got time to go into detail, but I just want to make one interesting comment. I was in a long distance communications unit, and it was an interesting job. I was in the reserves in Lebanon. I was on duty for 6 hours and off duty for 6 hours. And during the 6 hours that I was off duty, I would walk across, this is in the middle of the war, by the way. I would walk across one of the main roads over to the other side, and I became friendly with the Lebanese family who had a little grocery store. I mean, such a small little grocery store. And I'll end on this sentence, but it has a very emotional for me. We signed an agreement between human beings, not between governments. They would give me a Coke. By the way, it was a warm Coke, on condition that I taught their 2 children. The girl was about a 10-year-old and the boy was probably a 7-year-old, if I gave them English lessons. And so here in the middle of a war, an Israeli soldier is sitting in this little grocery store helping these children with their English homework. And, you know, it had an amazing effect on me. It's until today, we're talking, that was 1982, you know, where we are now, so many years have passed. I still remember the family. And I used to have the fantasy that one day we really will sign an agreement with the Lebanese. And if they're still in that little grocery store, I'm going there. And I want to hear what happened to those two kids and their English lessons, because that's what it's really all about.
That's
That
a
is
fabulous.
really what it's all about.
That's really a fabulous story and a hopeful story, just at that. Well, Paul, we cannot thank you enough for such incredible 3 weeks of really helping us learn more about what's happening on the ground. You know, for those of us, as I said, my last trip to Israel was just before the pandemic in 2019. So it's hard to imagine that, 2 years has passed and I haven't been able to be there, and so much has changed, not only around the world, but certainly in Israel, from not just, you know, from government to the impact of the virus to the Abraham Accord. So thank you for bringing us up to speed.
Thank you.
We wish you and your bride a wonderful, wonderful evening and night, a good sleep, a good schluff, as we say. And we'll look forward to inviting you back to teach again at Conference.
Thank you so much. I'd love to come back. Thank you so much. Keep well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
You too. Be strong.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody, for being with us.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Take care now.